Our next presentation is going to be from Reid Locklin, who's coming to us from St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. And Reid is presenting on Revisiting Lonergan's Relations to Indigenous Peoples of Turtle Island. So, Reid, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so I want to just begin by quickly acknowledging that I'm coming here from Williams Treaty Territory and the Toronto Purchase, which are Mississauga lands. And I want to express my gratitude to join with you here on lands of the Menominee, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and other indigenous nations of this territory. I want to give thanks also to Ben and to Joseph for the invitation to come, and to Ethan for actually forwarding this proposal, the call for papers to me, and suggesting that perhaps I should propose something. So I want to start in 2022. In the year 2022, in Canada and in the US, there were moments of remembrance. One thing that happened was that, and this was referred to in Samantha's presentation just a moment ago, one of the things that happened was Pope Francis, after a 7-year delay, came in specific response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to offer an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church for its role in the residential school system, system of schools that were run throughout Canada that we've heard about a bit already, that were intended to advance a project that was described as cultural genocide, to destroy Indigenous peoples by destroying their language and culture. So he came to make that apology. And at the same time, of course, we were just finishing a year of celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the publication of Bernard Lonergan's work, Method and Theology. These two events I want to suggest to you today are not entirely unconnected. They're connected in one respect, is that during his penitential pilgrimage, Pope Francis did something in Quebec City that hadn't, as far as I know, been done before. He cited Lonergan in one of his addresses. So somebody or one member of his staff had read some Lonergan and saw Lonergan as a resource for thinking about how to rebuild relationships. But I want to suggest that the other ways that they are connected is because Bernard Lonergan can, and I want to argue should, be seen in relationship to the legacy of the residential schools. This is the subject of a 2-year SHIRK grant. It's a funding agency in Canada. It's a 2-year grant that involves multiple scholars. We're in the 2nd year. We're wrapping up our work right now. Christine is involved in this project. The two co-PIs are folks that may be known to you, so Darren Diaz and Christine Jameson. And in this project, we've been looking at Lonergan in relationship to the residential schools and in relationship to Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island more broadly in several phases. One was to look specifically at the residential schools. Another piece that Christina was more involved with was looking more generally at themes of colonialism and anti-colonialism in Lonergan's thought. I'm going to focus more on the first of those pieces, and we can talk about the rest of it if we need to. In the work with residential schools, we looked at 2 residential schools in particular. Lonergan was a Jesuit, so we were looking at Jesuit residential schools. This is the school at Spanish, one of the largest schools in the system in Canada. It was run by the Upper Canada province of the Jesuits between 1913 and 1958. The other one is one that the archives are here. In addition to the National Bureau of Catholic Missions archives that are here, they also have it was the Wisconsin Jesuits who sponsor a number of schools in the western states, including Holy Rosary Mission in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which ran from 1887 to 1980 as a boarding school. It continues to run as a school, and it's actually the only of the boarding schools that the Jesuits still have a direct involvement in, but they closed the boarding school in 1980 and really took the school on a new path. It's now called Red Cloud School. So, I mean, just to give you some context, right? I go with students to the Shingwalk Residential School Center periodically. They have the archives from the Spanish school. During the last phase of its existence between the 1940s and 1950s, most of the archives are photographs. And it's because there was a Jesuit who was interested in photography, and none of those are by students. So there's photographs from and by students, as well as of and by staff. And I was there with students, and we were looking at photographs of that were from this latter period, so from between 55 and 58. And as we're looking at photographs, one of the guides of the archives, one of the archivists, was saying, "Oh yeah, that guy in there, he's in a number of the photographs. He was a notorious abuser." Right, one of the Jesuits, right? So there are pictures of him. And of course we know that sexual and physical abuse was very much part of the residential school experience for many students. And I was sitting there thinking, these pictures that I'm looking at, these pictures that are being taken of this residential school, this project of cultural genocide, with this abuser who's part of the community there. Lonergan was in Regis College at that time, writing Insight, as a member of the Upper Canada province of the Jesuits, right? At that time, the boarding school at Pine Ridge is at its largest extent. The boarding school is full. It's one of the largest boarding schools in the western states. There's also widespread abuse there. It has a different character than the school at Spanish. In the 1960s, when Lonergan is, after a time in the Greg, is back in Regis writing Method in Theology, they're beginning to rethink some elements of the school at Holy Rosary. They introduce a Native American Studies course. They begin to teach Lakota language at that time. Eventually they decide that they cannot run a boarding school, that's not moral, and they close it. And at that time, of course, Lonergan is in the States. He is in Harvard University and then Boston College. Right? So these are coterminous events, right? Lonergan is a Jesuit, and these Jesuits' projects of cultural genocide that are occurring at exactly the same time. But, of course, the next natural question is, are they connected? Right? And so we asked this in several different respects. By the way, I was talking with the archivist here at Marquette, and she was like, "I don't think Lonergan visited these schools." And I said, "I never thought Lonergan visited these schools." And she said, "I don't think he worked at any of those schools." I said, "I never thought that Lonergan worked at any of these schools," right? But he's an Upper Canada Jesuit, and so John Meehan, who is a Jesuit historian, was looking at the school at Spanish in particular. And of course, Lonergan is moving in a world and crossing paths with lots of folks who are connected to the school at Spanish. What's remarkable is how separate they are, though, right? And John Meehan has really shown me that in terms of the Jesuit structure at that time, it was very top-down. Lonergan was very deliberately and insulated from many other parts of the Jesuit apostolate, including the schools. And so there's really not a lot of connection. I mean, there are people that he went to school with, obviously, there's lots of connections. But the different parts of the Jesuit apostolates were often, they didn't touch each other. The person who was in touch with all of them was the superior, by and large. And so I remember at one point, John, I was talking about the controversy. There was a huge controversy when the Jesuits decided to close that school in the 1950s. I was like, Lonergan's there, right? He must have been involved in these conversations. And John was like, "You're thinking about the way Jesuits do things now." He said he wouldn't have been involved in any of those conversations. So anyway, so it's interesting. With regard to Holy Rosary is further away, right? It's run by a different province of the Jesuits, the Wisconsin province. This was this province at that time. But there are threads of connection, right? So Eugene Kalash is a Jesuit. We spent I worked with two research assistants, Kyle Ferguson and Yu Lee, to try to do a bunch of detective work and see how these things could be connected. And we found one student who did his regency at Holy Rosary Mission and then did a doctorate at Newman at the Greg when Lonergan was there. And I find it hard to imagine that they never talked about Newman, given Lonergan's interest in Newman. I find it hard to believe that Kalash would never have talked about his experience at the school, right? So I don't have any evidence that happened, but I find it hard to believe that it didn't happen. Holy Rosary Mission was incredibly prominent in the publication Jesuit Missions, beginning in 1938, which was a kind of record of Jesuit work in many different ministries in many different parts of the world. Holy Rosary Mission appeared every year or two in that thing, probably for fundraising purposes, right? It's a very positive portrayal of the school, right? And they published a yearbook, right? I don't know if Lonergan ever read Jesuit Missions, but Regis College had it in their collection, right? So it was there, right? So these various threads. So the first part of the project was to say, do we find any specific connections? And I had all kinds of intuitions about the connections we would find, and we didn't find many of them. Okay. So the next phase was to say, well, what do we see in his writings about indigenous peoples? How do they appear when they appear? And they don't appear that often, but when they do appear, they appear in very specific ways, right? So the first way, I say there are bookends on his career. There are two really specific references to indigenous peoples of Turtle Island that come at the beginning of his career and then towards the end of his career. So he writes two short pieces. One of them is on the so-called Canadian martyrs in 1941, so early. And he's talking about Jesuit history on Turtle Island. And he describes the history in a very specific way. He says, he contrasts the way that the Jesuits lived to the way that merchants and soldiers interacted with indigenous peoples to valorize the Jesuits. And he said he came and lived in wigwams with the savages instead of trying to exploit them. So it was very positive. In another piece, in this quartercentenary piece, he contrasts the work of the Jesuits in India and China to the works of the Jesuits in Turtle Island. And he says, in India and China, the project of the Jesuits was to enculturate, was to engage with a culture that was there. He says that in Turtle Island, the task was different. It was the creation of civilization. Right? Creation of civilization. Then, in 1971, there's an interview. It's actually here in the Marquette archives. You can get it. It's a video that you can watch called The Total Context. And he has this wonderful reflection on the Dakota, actually, Samantha's nation, in which he describes the Dakota when he's talking about religion as an instinct. And he describes this intuitive ecology of Dakota people. It's very positive. It's very romanticized, right? The children of the forest is the way that she put it. And that's exactly the way he talks about the Dakota. And what's interesting to me about that one in particular is that it happens in 1971. In 1968, there's a historic occupation of the Cornwall-Massena Bridge, a bridge that had been built across Akwesasne territory. You may not know, the Akwesasne Nation has a reserve that's on both sides of the settler border, right? So it's in both Canada and the US. They argued that because of the Jays Treaty, they should be able to cross the bridge without paying the toll, which they were absolutely legally correct about. The settler state did not agree, and so they occupied the bridge. In 1973, back in Pine Ridge, there was the famous occupation at Wounded Knee. In between them is Alcatraz and other elements of the sovereignty movement. But this is right. Lonergan gives the interview that I mentioned in Montreal. He's in Toronto at that point. This is right on the road from Montreal, from Toronto to Montreal, right? He would have driven past it. There's a documentary film that's produced in 1969, so it's not like it's something that's unknown. And so I say, what do we have here? We have him reflecting very positively about this remote, romanticized vision of the Dakota without mentioning indigenous peoples right on his doorstep demanding sovereignty, or talking about the primary way in which the Jesuits would have been interacting with the Dakota and the Lakota, which is through these schools, a number of which are still running at that time, right? Okay, but we can sort of look at that and say, there but for the grace of God go I, right? Lonergan was a creature of his time, so am I, so are we all, right? I worked with a student to say, well, we need to look at not just his passing mentions, but to the structure of his thought, the structure of Lonergan's thought. And I worked with a student on some of this. So when indigenous peoples come up, they almost always come up as illustrations of archaic or primitive religions. In Method and Theology, he talks about the strength and weakness of early language. Arguably, and this is something that came up a lot yesterday, and very usefully, I think. He also talks quite a bit about, he's got a kind of commitment to a certain notion of scientific objectivity related to subjectivity, as we heard earlier today, very useful, really wonderfully. And he also has various images of progress. And some of those images of progress are pretty linear. Like they progress from stages to stages. And I want to give you just one example of this in Topics in Education from 1959. At one point he's talking about the integration, levels of integration of common sense and the differentiation of consciousness. And he goes through it step by step. So he says we have undifferentiated common sense, it's clearly a hierarchical scheme, differentiated common sense, classicism and differentiation of consciousness, the development of theory, and then historical consciousness as sort of the highest form of integration. Fair enough. He narrates this historically. He gives examples from periods of history of these different movements. So of course, historical consciousness is a phenomenon of the present. He gives lots of examples from European philosophy to describe this. For classicism, the differentiation of consciousness, his primary reference points are ancient Greece and the medieval university. For differentiated common sense, he gives early civilization, Babylonia, Indus Valley, Incas, Mayas. So Abya, South America is represented there, but these particular civilizations. And then for undifferentiated common sense, he gives the examples of the Inuit, he calls them Eskimos, the Pygmies, and the Bushmen. So my student, who's indigenous, noticed this, and I said, well, I've seen that, it's always the people at the bottom of this, I get that, I've already covered this. And she says, no, look at it more closely. This is a history that he's telling. This is a history that he's telling. He talks about a new phase in history, right? She says, present, past, past, past. But these are his contemporaries. Right? When he writes this, the Inuit their way of life is just really sort of the settler state has just noticed them and is really working to destroy their way of life at the moment that he writes it, right? So a lot of the stories of the Inuit are from the 1940s and 1950s. So you look at this and you say, I think it's hard not to look at this and say, this is a blueprint of the residential schools, right? These people are in the position of the past. And so what do? You past them. Right? You don't kill them, of course. You only destroy the societies that belong to the past. Right? Now, he does not do this. He does not make that connection, but this is the structure of the residential school system. Right? So, what do we do with this? Right? So what do we do with this material? Somebody approached me at the American Academy of Religion just recently and said, I hear you're trying to cancel Lonergan. And I said, I am not trying to cancel Lonergan. I am trying to be thoughtful about an appropriation of Lonergan. And the reason I'm criticizing Lonergan is as a way of critiquing my own theology, right? So if we can think about this constructively with a great thinker like Lonergan, maybe I can think about it constructively in my own thought. Right? So I'm going to suggest three things that are not worked out in any detail in my mind, but that I think might be ways forward in being a bit more constructive. So what can we do to reconsider Lonergan in a way that avoids some of these constructions, which I think are really destructive in his thought? One of them came out in the exchange between Stephen Pluhacek and Taylor. One of the things that when you heard him presenting on home and house, you pointed out that Lonergan talks about theory and common sense, right? And I think that one of the things that needs to happen is a revalorization of common sense, right? And I think this is in Lonergan. I don't think this actually contradicts what he does, but he does tend to theory as sort of stands above and over common sense. We've all been in departments where we have a whole bunch of people who are very skilled at theory and not very skilled at common sense, and we know that that's destructive, right? That's almost always a bad community. And so I think that there's something here about recuperating, especially in insight, especially not so much in method, but in insight. Lonergan actually, I think, has a strong sense of the importance of common sense. As being not something that is ever sublated away. Right? Not even sublated in the Lonerganian sense, but not sublated at all. It stands alongside theory. right, as being important. I think there's another thing that we need to do, which is, and again, I think this is, I was rereading the section of method, of topics in education that I spent so much time on. And I think Lonergan does this as well. He talks about progress, he doesn't use those terms in topics in education, but what later gets coded as progress, decline, and redemptive recovery, as the heuristic of history. Right? He actually says in topics, he said, I've narrated these as things that happen in sequence, but of course they never happen in sequence. Right? And I think that there's a really important way of looking at these as things that often happen at exactly the same time. So yesterday we heard a lot about science and technology, which on the one hand, I think Francis is very good on this, is a moment of progress, and also a moment of devastating decline. In one and the same moment, right? And I think that if we can sort of take those things that are and put them together temporally, then we're in better shape. And then finally, we were reading a piece in one of the groups that's come out in the second year of this project. We were reading a piece by Aaron Mills, who's a student of John Barrows, who's an indigenous Anishinaabe legal theorist. And he's telling stories, and he talks about how you have to learn to learn, right? Learn to learn. And he's talking about approaching elders. But it really resonated with Lonergan, in my view. You know, we have to learn, right? But we always do that in context and in culture. And I think it would be very helpful if we think about differentiation of consciousness and the idea of conversions as things that don't necessarily translate to other contexts. It's not a property of me. It's a property of my proficiency in a particular context. And I think that if we read Lonergan that way, I think that it would be a much more fruitful way to think about Lonergan in relationship to indigenous ways of sacred life ways and ways of knowing. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Reid. Questions?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Reid. And these are, I think, important questions to ask about Lonergan or about anyone.
Sure.
And especially anyone who has influences of the kind that Lonergan has, and anybody else. So I think it's important. I appreciate very much the way you did the reconsiderations, all of which I think are quite accurate to my understanding of Lonergan. Just one anecdote I want to share. This has to do with the whether or not. So this is something. If I were you, I would sort of drop out.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's hard to believe that Kolech didn't talk to Lonergan about Newman.
Yeah.
I talked to Lonergan.
Yeah.
I know people who talk to Lonergan. He's a very diffident guy.
Right.
For a guy who valorized the way he did asking questions, he was really, really not good at answering questions on the spot. When I was working on my master's thesis, I went over to where he was living when he was at Harvard and had a conversation with him about it. And he was polite, and he wasn't brash or rude to me in any way. But I didn't really I wasn't eager to go back and talk to him again. He was not a really approachable guy, and it was just a function of his personality.
Sure.
There were, there were a small number of people like Joe Kmanchek and Fred Lawrence and Dave Tracy who would go and talk to him. Most of the students were just intimidated by him. So the Kolech would go and say, "Hey, Father Lonnie, let's talk about it."
Right.
Well, can I rule it out that he
Right.
No, but I just think
So maybe it's not as possible. Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair.
I don't think that's crucial to your.
It's not at all. Actually, it's actually part of it's one. Can I actually just tell you a story in response to that? So one of the things that motivated this whole project was I worked at Holy Rosary Mission. So I spent a year and a half there as a young undergraduate as a visit volunteer. And my volunteer director, David Shields, who I'm going to see tomorrow, he lives here in the Milwaukee area. I'm supposed to be over here, aren't I? He studied with Lonergan, right? So when this project was coming out, I was like, God, there must have been a whole bunch of students of Lonergan at Holy Rosary. No, that was a later development. Like again, this part of it was predicting the present on the past. But it was David Shields. At one point, I was corresponding with him by email, and I said something about Lonergan, and he said Lonergan was a wonder man and scholar. but he was tuned into radio stations no one else could hear. Which confirms what you're saying.
The other thing I wanted to say, and I think the things, where you had the examples that he uses of undifferentiated consciousness,
Yeah.
I think that's quite a legitimate thing to bring forward and to raise questions about. But I do think the way that in which you spoke about it in your reconsideration here certainly reflects where he was by the time he wrote Method in Theology.
Right.
Those things that you have where he uses the illustration. And I was present when he would talk about Native Americans.
Oh, really? Okay. This is helpful.
But in particular, he used as an example, he called them Indians, Native Americans, First Nations person, who it wasn't him, but somebody he knew who was guided by this man. And so the man started asking him questions about, well, how do you know how to find your way through the forest? And he would just say, well, you know.
Right.
And he would repeat that over and over again. And his point was, this man had a wisdom.
Right.
And it wasn't a wisdom that he would articulate in a way that was that could be, given as an algorithm that this other man.
Right.
man could understand.
That's great. Thank you.
And I guess the last thing I would say is, I would have to go back and look and see where Lonergan actually uses the phrase scientific objectivity.
Right. I don't think he does. I don't think he does. Yeah.
Objectivity is something that he thought was characteristic and intrinsic to all human knowing, common sense included.
For sure.
So I think that I think people read Lonergan as saying, well, the real objectivity is in science. His concern with regard to common sense is not that it's a primitive or deficient form of intelligence.
Right.
His concern is that it tends to have a bias against other kinds of intelligence. And
For sure.
That's why it ends up looking like that.
For sure.
But in fact, I think one of the most brilliant things that he did was his account of common sense, and it's important.
In Insight, it's just so much better than elsewhere, in my view. Like in Insight, I reread when I was reading Insight like last year when I was seeing these pictures, and I was very impressed by his account in Common Sense and Insight. That it was much more textured than I remembered or expected. Yeah. So yeah. I think we're running short on time, but
these are. Is it okay with everybody else if we push another 5 minutes or so?
Yes.
We have plenty of time for lunch break as we did yesterday, so
Sure.
let's just run over.
What you haven't just talked about is you can find Lonergan stating this and caring about meaning. It's book form. I got a copy online. Usually they're like hundreds of dollars. I found one time for like $40 and I went for it. But it's one of the interviews that Lonergan did very late in his life. And I think it was because his father was a surveyor. And
Right.
so this was a story that had been told to him because the surveyors, of course, were led by Indigenous folks, First Nations folks. Something that...
does he actually? Sorry, just a quick question. Does he actually talk about his father's relationship with Indigenous peoples in that work?
As far as I can tell, just in this one narrative. And
Okay.
He names common sense.
Because we've wondered about that. In the team, we've talked about his dad being a surveyor and how he must have had relationships with Indigenous... Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's caring about meaning. I believe it's
Yeah,
also on
thank
our
you.
online.
Thank you.
You can find the recordings of it.
Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. It's something I've also been wrestling with. One thing that was in the back of my mind is Andrew Prevost gave a very similar talk on Lonergan and post-colonialism at Boston College a couple of years ago. So it might be interesting to reach out to him as well. He's at Georgetown.
Yeah.
But in my thinking of Lonergan on history, it's very significant that Lonergan conceived of his project fundamentally as one of creating a theory of history that would be adequate as a response to Marxism.
Right.
But to my mind, what he doesn't part ways with Marxism regarding is its stadial or sort of evolutionary nature.
Right. And that's the problem, right? Yeah.
And at Notre Dame, David Antigua doesn't reference Lonergan. Monica had referenced Antigua earlier. But he does decry a stadial notion of history as anti.
I think that has to be wiped out of Lonergan. But just to say that Gordon Grixon really helped me with this. The way that he helped me come to this is he said what you need to think is that Lonergan's working out these ideas, and he has to work them out somewhere, and so he works them out in the history that he knows. But as you said, Pat, I mean, like, my hope is that if Lonergan, I guess he does see this, I hope that he's happy about this work, right? But to say that what Gord said is that you shouldn't take that as then his view on all history. You should take that as his working out the categories in the history that he knows, right? And so that's the way that Gordon helped me sort of say that I don't need to think of the stadial structure as intrinsic to the thought. I really like the way that you put it, Ethan, which is to say, can we talk about progress in a way that doesn't have stages, that isn't linear, but that allows for the possibility of saying, oh, this is how we make progress in this situation, right? And I think you could read Lonergan that way, yeah.
Could we maybe hear the two questions
Yeah,
together
sure,
and
yeah.
then get a single response to them? Because I want to give you...
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick. The kernel of it is a suggestion about the revalorizing of common sense.
Yeah, okay.
This is something I mentioned to Taylor in response to his question yesterday. A number of essays in a third collection, Theology and Praxis, the ongoing generation of methods, and a post-Hegelian philosophy of religion. Lonergan gives an account of praxis, which runs in parallel. He runs it in parallel to the sort of empirical emergence of differentiations of consciousness. And I think the connection to Marx is quite apt, because as you go up the scale of values, and if you're inclined to connect that to the levels of consciousness, right. There are certain material conditions that have to get online for you to have the surpluses you need to have like a cultural superstructure. Like if you just don't have enough food, you're not going to have English professors.
Right, for sure. We might be there soon.
Indeed. But when he pivots to praxis, the principle is the authenticity of persons.
Yeah.
And it emerges first as judgments of value, which I was thinking about in the previous panel when they were talking about the interface between the empirical scientific investigation of the wild rice, but how is it guided the interface with indigenous culture? Sensitive express judgments of value. So I think the place to go, rather than to try to use the apparatus of common sense with the limitations that Pat put out, would be to go to these late developments of the notion of praxis as having its principle in the authenticity.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, just go ahead. I'll ask you later.
No, I don't have an answer to that. I just appreciate it. Yeah.
It wasn't a question. So.
Yeah. No.
All right. Then, within this kind of timeline of examples and things like this, you're like everything in Lonergan, everything seems to hinge on stuff that happened in 1965.
Right.
And so I just wonder, to the degree that, we ascribe his sort of breakthrough to not just the functional specialization, but to the empirical notion of culture in dimensions of meaning in 1965, and I think I would kind of say also in Existenza and Aggiornamento in 1964. In Insight Revisited, he kind of moves the date way back. I don't really buy it, but by dimensions of meaning, certainly, like it's durably in place. How does that that he seemed to think that had a pretty radical set of implications for kind of everything that he had done and was going to do. That would seem to have some pretty radical implications for this story as well. So I'm just curious how that fits into...
I have a love-hate relationship with Lonergan on culture, right? So it's where he gets to kind of a real pluralism, which I think is really important, right? So, Audra Simpson is a Kanyen'kehá:ka author. She wrote a book called Mohawk Interruptus. And in that, she takes aim at he's in dialogue with modern anthropology, so folks like Victor Turner and Mary Douglas and this kind of thing. And she demonstrates quite persuasively, in my view, that the category of culture is created as part of the colonial project to past indigenous peoples, right? And Lonergan is his use of culture. Again, through no fault of his own, he's writing in the 1960s when this is the notion of culture, right? So I don't know what to do with that yet. because I don't think that we can simply use it as Lonergan used it, because it carries too much of this baggage that isn't his baggage, it's other baggage. But it's clearly the space where it's the space where he makes a bunch of moves that I think are really important. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think it can just be used. I think it has to be. I think the way you put it is, I think that going to 1965 in that moment of realization is probably a better way to use that than to just take his idea of culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
I just wonder
That's very
how
helpful. Yeah.
reinterprets his own.
Right. Exactly. That's the place where some of the pieces break loose, right? And culture helps him do that. And that's not culture. It's not culture's fault that it has baggage, and that's not Lonergan's fault either. Yeah.
Just one quick thing.
I just want your, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, something that's relevant to this, to Reid's talk, but also other things. Lonergan, when he had his surgery for lung cancer, he thought he was going to die.
Right.
And he was deeply sorrowful that he had committed the sin of smoking and that he was not going to finish the work that God asked him to do. This was a real existential crisis for him, and it was right around 1965. I forget exactly when the surgery for lung cancer.
July of 65.
So the fact that he lived long enough to finish method theology, he thought was a profound invention of God's part in his life. So I just want to.
That's great. Thank you.
1965, but I think it's important to keep that in mind.
That's great. And let me just say that I was a little afraid to present this here, but it was precisely in the hopes that we would have the kind of conversation we just had. So I'm really, really grateful for the response. Thank you very much.
I have every supposition this talk will continue over lunch.
Yeah.
Let's thank Reid.